The night howled with the kind of storm that made even the strongest men stay behind bolted doors, but she had no such safety. The stable walls trembled with every crash of thunder, loose boards groaning beneath the weight of the wind, and rain seeped through the gaps like cold fingers tracing her shivering skin. She had been left there to die, no midwife, no husband, no fire to ease her pain. Her belly twisted with contractions that felt like they were tearing her apart, and each scream she released was swallowed by the roar of the tempest outside. The horses stomped nervously, their breath white in the chill air, as if they, too, could sense death pacing near the threshold. She tried to pray, but her voice broke, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. The pain came in waves that left her gasping for breath. She had lost count of the hours, maybe it had been 1, maybe 10. Her fingers clawed the straw beneath her, soaked with sweat and water, and her hair clung to her face in tangled ribbons. The child inside her was fighting for life as much as she was, each contraction a war between survival and surrender. Her mind drifted between memory and delirium, her wedding day beneath the prairie sun, her husband's promise of safety, his cold eyes when he realized the child was not his. That was when the punishment had begun. That was why she was here now, alone in this stable, her body broken, her cries unheard. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it the distant echo of hooves. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of her fevered mind, but then she heard it again, steady, deliberate. A shadow moved at the edge of the lightning's flash, and the horses snorted, stamping restlessly. Fear clutched her heart tighter than pain. She wanted to call out, but all that came was a hoarse moan. The door creaked open, and for a moment she thought she saw death itself standing there, tall, dark, wrapped in the dripping hides of a stranger. But then the lightning struck again, and she saw the paint on his face, the braids of black hair, the eyes sharp as obsidian. An Apache. She tried to crawl away, but her strength failed. The man didn't move toward her at first. He stood still, taking in the sight before him, the woman writhing on the ground, the blood-stained straw, the flickering lantern barely holding its flame. He muttered something in a language she didn't understand, a sound low and heavy, like the murmur of the earth itself. Then he stepped inside, his movements quiet but certain, closing the door against the storm. She flinched as he knelt beside her, but when his hand touched her forehead, it was not with violence, it was with a kind of solemn care she hadn't felt in years. He spoke to her softly, his accent thick, words simple. "You hurt. Baby, come." She could only nod, sobbing, unable to form words. He moved quickly then, lighting a small fire from the remnants of a candle stub and the dry straw hidden in the corner. He tore strips from his blanket, laid them near the fire to warm, and took a water skin from his horse. Every motion was sure, practiced, as though he had done this before. She watched him through eyes blurred with pain, too weak to question why a man who should have been her enemy was saving her. Hours passed in a blur of agony and light. The Apache worked beside her tirelessly, guiding her through the waves of pain, whispering words she couldn't understand but somehow believed. His hands were firm when she needed them to be, gentle when she broke. When she screamed, he didn't flinch, when she wept, he didn't look away. Outside, the storm raged, tearing branches from trees, flooding the earth, but inside that fragile wooden shelter, a different kind of battle was being fought, a battle against the death that had been waiting for her since the first contraction. When the child finally came, it was with a sound so piercing, so fragile, it seemed to still the storm for a heartbeat. The woman collapsed back into the straw, shaking, sobbing, barely able to believe the weight of the tiny body pressed against her chest. The Apache cut the cord with his knife, careful and clean, then wrapped the newborn in the corner of his blanket. He looked at the child with a strange expression, something between awe and sorrow, before placing the bundle back into her trembling arms. The baby's cries softened, replaced by the small, unsteady rhythm of new life. She whispered, why help me?" But her voice was barely a whisper, her strength nearly gone. The Apache did not answer right away. He fed the fire instead, tossing in what little would remain, then looked at her. "Life," he said slowly, touching his chest. "No man can throw away." She didn't understand the full meaning of his words, but something in the tone made her close her eyes and weep again, not from pain this time, but from the ache of being seen, of being treated as human when her own had abandoned her. As dawn broke, the storm faded, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed sacred. The woman slept, her breathing slow, the baby nestled against her. The Apache sat near the doorway, his gaze lost in the mist-covered hills beyond. He knew he should leave before the sun rose high enough for others to find him. If the settlers came and saw him there, they would hang him from the nearest tree without asking what he had done. Yet he couldn't move, not yet. Something in the sight of the two, the mother and her child, held him there, like a spirit bound to witness what mercy still existed in a cruel world. When she awoke, weak but alive, she found him still sitting there. The fire had died down, and light spilled through the gaps in the wood, painting his face in gold and shadow. "You saved us," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. He shook his head slowly. "You strong," he said, his voice quiet. "You live because you fight." Then he rose, adjusting the blanket over his shoulders, and turned toward the door. Panic gripped her chest. "Wait," she called, reaching out with trembling fingers. "I don't even know your name." He paused, looking back only once. "Chayton," he said simply. Then, without another word, he stepped into the pale light of morning, leaving behind the only proof of his presence, the warmth of life he had returned to a woman left for dead. The wind caught the door as it swung shut behind him, carrying away the last trace of his voice. She clutched her child closer, the name echoing in her mind like a prayer. Chayton. It sounded like something ancient, something meant to be remembered. Outside, the sky began to clear, a single shaft of sunlight breaking through the clouds to fall upon the roof of the old stable. For the first time in days, she felt warmth seep back into her bones. She closed her eyes and whispered his name again, a promise to never forget the man who had done what no one else could. Days passed before she could stand again, and each sunrise reminded her of the one who had vanished with the storm. The stable, once a prison of death, had become a cradle of rebirth. The baby thrived against all odds, crying softly when the wind blew and sleeping soundly when she sang. Yet every time she looked toward the hills, she imagined the Apache's dark silhouette on horseback, watching over her from afar. The settlers eventually found her, drawn by the smoke that had risen from her weak attempts at a fire. They were astonished to see her alive, holding a healthy child in her arms. None could understand how she had survived, but when she whispered that an Apache had saved her, their faces twisted with disbelief and fear. They warned her to keep silent. "Don't tell anyone," one man said, eyes darting nervously toward the horizon. "If word gets out, they'll hunt him down." But how could she not speak of the one who had done what no white man dared? She bit her tongue and nodded, but the truth burned in her heart like a secret flame. They took her back to the settlement, cleaned her wounds, and buried her past under whispers and lies. She was found by the grace of God, they said, erasing the name of the man who had been her salvation. Life in the settlement was no kinder than before. The women avoided her, afraid that whatever curse had driven her husband away might still linger. The men looked at her differently now, some with pity, some with lust, but none with the simple kindness that had shone in Chayton's eyes. She kept mostly to herself, tending to her baby, whom she named Hope. It was a small act of defiance, a reminder that even in the darkness, life had found a way to bloom. Yet at night, when the wind rustled through the grass, she would dream of that storm, of the warmth of his hands and the steady rhythm of his breathing as he worked to keep her alive. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that blanketed the prairie in white silence. Food was scarce, and sickness spread through the camp. The baby grew thin, her cries weaker each night. The mother's heart ached with helplessness. She prayed, begged for help, but the same people who had once saved her now turned her away. "We've got our own to feed," they said coldly. Desperation pushed her toward a choice she had never imagined, leaving the settlement to find the man who had once brought her back from death. She wrapped the child in every piece of cloth she owned and stepped into the wilderness once more. The cold cut like knives, and her body trembled with exhaustion, but something deeper than reason drove her forward. She followed the path she remembered, the broken trees, the bend in the river, the rocks where she had first seen his horse's tracks. Her lips were blue, her fingers numb, yet she kept whispering his name with each step. Chayton. Chayton. The wind offered no answer, but in the distance, a flicker of smoke appeared, faint against the gray sky. Hope, fragile but real, pulsed in her chest. By the time she reached the camp, she was half frozen and delirious. The Apache men rose as she stumbled into the clearing, their faces hard and suspicious. They shouted in their tongue, weapons drawn, but she fell to her knees before they could stop her. "Please," she gasped, clutching the child to her chest. "Chayton. I need Chayton." For a moment, there was silence. Then one of the men stepped forward, his expression shifting. He turned and called toward the largest tent, his voice carrying across the snow. From the shadows, Chayton emerged, taller than she remembered, his eyes filled with disbelief. He moved to her side without hesitation, catching her before she fell. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "White people kill for less." She smiled weakly, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I came because they would let us die," she whispered. "You're the only one who didn't." He looked down at the bundle in her arms, saw the frail child trembling within it, and something in him broke. He turned to his people and spoke quickly, his tone commanding. They hesitated, but then a woman stepped forward, taking the baby gently from her arms. That night, the camp's fires burned bright, casting long shadows on the snow. The Apache women tended to the child, feeding her broth and wrapping her in furs. The mother lay near the flames, her body weak but her spirit at peace for the first time since the storm. Chayton sat beside her, silent as always, yet his presence was a shield against the cold and the world's cruelty. "You should rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow, you go back." But she shook her head. "There is no going back," she replied. "Not for me." Weeks turned to months, and the impossible happened. The white woman and her child became part of the Apache camp. Some still distrusted her, but others came to see her as a symbol, proof that compassion could cross even the bloodiest divide. Chayton taught her their ways, how to ride, how to track, how to listen to the earth. She learned his language slowly, and in the rhythm of their shared silences, something deeper than gratitude began to bloom. They were two souls carved by loss, drawn together by the same thread of defiance against fate. One spring morning, she stood beside him at the edge of the river, watching the water rush by, full of new life. "You saved me once," she said, her voice soft as the wind. "But what if I was meant to find you instead?" Chayton looked at her for a long time, his eyes reflecting both the sorrow of what had been lost and the fragile beauty of what had been found. He took her hand, their fingers intertwining like roots finding soil. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "we both were saved." Years later, travelers spoke of a woman who lived among the Apache, her child growing strong beneath the desert sun. Some said she was a ghost, others a myth. But those who rode far enough into the wilderness swore they had seen her, standing beside a man with dark braids and eyes like the storm, both watching the horizon in silence. And when the wind shifted just right, it carried a single name across the plains, a name born in blood, redeemed in mercy, and remembered by the earth itself. Chayton.